A man wakes before dawn in a Spartan barracks that no longer echoes the way it once did. The room is quieter now, fewer bodies, fewer breaths in the dark. He pulls on his cloak, stiff with age, and listens for sounds of life beyond the walls. There are none. No marching feet, no shouted orders, only silence and the knowledge that silence here is dangerous. Because Sparta was never meant to be quiet. And yet, even now, thin, aging, shrinking, others still fear it. This is the story of a power that outlived itself, a society that became trapped inside its own reputation. By the end of this story, you'll understand how fear can persist long after the strength that created it has already begun to rot. If these stories matter to you, consider liking the video or subscribing. Each one takes time to make, and even small gestures help keep the work going. Leave a comment, surprise us where you are listening from. Now settle in and let the story unfold. Sparta did not collapse in flames. It hardened. And that distinction matters. Long after its armies grew smaller, long after its citizens became rare enough to count by name, the idea of Sparta continued to terrify the Greek world. Not because of what it could still do, but because of what people believed it had once been capable of. And Sparta understood this. It learned to live inside that belief, feeding it, guarding it, relying on it, even as the foundations beneath it weakened. Fear became a substitute for flexibility. From the outside, Sparta still looked intact. The laws remained unchanged. The rituals continued without deviation. The discipline was still enforced with ritualized cruelty. To rivals, this rigidity looked like strength. To allies, it looked dependable. To subject populations, it looked inescapable. But inside the city, pressure was building. Sparta had always been fragile in one crucial way. It was small. Its citizen body was never large, and over time it only shrank. Wars took men. Strict social rules excluded others. Wealth concentrated. Families died out. Every generation left fewer full citizens behind. And unlike other Greek states, Sparta had no easy way to replace them. There was no openness, no absorption of outsiders, no reinvention. What Sparta had instead was fear, carefully cultivated, relentlessly maintained. The system depended on it. The ruling elite told themselves that fear was stability, that terror was order, that mercy was weakness. And for centuries it had worked, at least well enough. Subject populations remained obedient, rivals hesitated, allies deferred, but fear has a cost, and Sparta paid it daily. The young were trained not to question, only to endure. The old clung to traditions that had once kept them safe, but now kept them rigid. Every deviation was treated as a threat, every reform as a crack in the wall. Sparta's institutions did not bend under pressure. They tightened. This tightening created an illusion that the system was becoming purer, stronger, more authentically Spartan. In reality, it was becoming brittle. The fewer citizens there were, the more valuable, and therefore the more controlled, they became. The state monitored behavior, wealth, marriage, and inheritance with growing anxiety. Not because it was confident, but because it was afraid. Afraid of dilution, afraid of revolt, afraid of being exposed. And exposure was the one thing Sparta could not survive, because once the world saw what Sparta had become, once rivals realized how few men stood behind the legend, the fear would evaporate, and with it, everything holding the system together. So the performance continued. Public discipline remained brutal. Ritualized violence was not reduced but emphasized. The message was clear. Sparta was still Sparta, still unyielding, still merciless. The terror was not a byproduct anymore. It was the point. Subject populations understood this before anyone else. They felt the tightening first. Surveillance increased. Punishments grew harsher. The unspoken message was constant. Obedience was the only thing keeping catastrophe at bay. For the Spartan elite, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was panic management. They were running out of men, running out of options, running out of time. And yet, outwardly, nothing changed. This was Sparta's paradox in decline. The weaker it became, the more aggressively it had to project strength. Every public action had to reinforce the myth. Every internal doubt had to be buried. The system could not admit error, because admitting error would invite challenge. So fear remained the currency. Not just fear of Spartan spears, but fear of Spartan unpredictability, fear of ancient discipline, fear of what a society trained from birth to suppress mercy might still be willing to do. That fear lingered across Greece, and it bought Sparta time. But time without adaptation is not recovery. It is delay. Inside the city, men noticed the empty places. They noticed the thinning ranks. They noticed that rituals designed for a larger population now felt hollow, repeated by fewer voices, enforced by aging overseers who remembered a past their sons could not recreate. No one said this aloud. Sparta was a society that punished recognition of weakness as harshly as weakness itself, and so the pressure remained unspoken, contained, compressed. Fear still worked, barely, and because it still worked, nothing changed. Not yet. The pressure did not announce itself with riots or open defiance. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, it crept inward. Sparta's institutions had been designed for a world where fear flowed outward, toward enemies, rivals, and subject peoples. In decline, that fear began to circulate internally. The state watched its own citizens with the same suspicion it once reserved for conquered populations. Loyalty was assumed in theory, tested constantly in practice. The system responded to stress the only way it knew how, by tightening. Property rules hardened. Citizenship requirements grew more unforgiving. Men who failed to meet exacting standards, economic, behavioral, hereditary, were quietly excluded. Each exclusion reduced the citizen body further, which in turn made the remaining citizens more valuable, more irreplaceable, and more closely monitored. This was not reform. It was contraction disguised as discipline. Every generation felt it. Young men trained for a place, in a system that no longer had room for them. Failure did not mean correction. It meant disappearance, loss of status, loss of voice, sometimes loss of protection. In a society where identity and survival were inseparable from the state, exclusion was a kind of social death. The ruling elite understood the numbers. They had to. They also understood what those numbers meant. Sparta could not afford internal dissent. Not now. Not when its margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. So the system leaned harder on obedience, harder on ritual, harder on punishment. Fear became preventative medicine. For subject populations, this shift was unmistakable. Surveillance intensified. Arbitrary violence increased. Public examples were made more often, not less. The goal was no longer just control. It was deterrence through unpredictability. No one was meant to feel safe enough to test the limits. This brutality served a dual purpose. Outwardly, it reinforced the myth. Inwardly, it reassured the elite that they still held the line. But it came at a cost. Violence that is routine stops being strategic. It becomes reflex, and reflex does not discriminate. The same methods used to intimidate subjects began to shape how Spartans treated one another. Suspicion replaced trust. Silence replaced debate. Political life narrowed until only conformity could survive. Disagreement did not vanish. It went underground. Within the ruling class, fractures appeared. Not ideological ones, practical ones. How much pressure was too much? How long could the system endure this level of repression before it broke something essential? No one framed these questions publicly. That itself was the fracture. A society that cannot argue cannot adapt. A society that cannot adapt can only endure, until endurance runs out. Sparta's leaders responded to uncertainty with ritual. Ancient laws were invoked with increasing frequency, not because they offered solutions, but because they offered legitimacy. The past became a shield. If a policy could be justified as traditional, it was insulated from challenge. This reliance on antiquity was comforting. It was also paralyzing. Every problem was interpreted as a failure of discipline rather than a failure of structure. If citizens were fewer, it was because standards were slipping. If loyalty wavered, it was because punishment was insufficient. The answer was always more control, never reconsideration. And so, the system began to feed on itself. The human cost accumulated quietly. Men lived under constant evaluation. Families measured their worth not by prosperity or contribution, but by survival within the rules. Marriage became calculation. Childbearing became obligation. Fear entered the household, not as an external threat, but as a constant presence shaping every decision. Sparta had once prided itself on collective purpose. In decline, that purpose narrowed into mere compliance. Outsiders still saw unity. Insiders felt isolation, and yet the fear held. Rival states hesitated. Allies deferred. The legend continued to do its work. Stories of Spartan severity, Spartan endurance, Spartan cruelty circulated more widely than ever, because they were still being enacted. This was the danger. Fear was still effective. As long as it worked, the leadership could justify the cost. As long as no one openly challenged Sparta, the system could pretend it was succeeding. The absence of rebellion was mistaken for stability. But stability built on repression is brittle. It does not bend. It snaps. Sparta was approaching that point, even if no one could yet name it. The institutions had tightened to the edge of their tolerance. The citizen body had shrunk to the edge of viability. The political culture had narrowed to the edge of silence. Fear still projected outward, but inside the city it had begun to turn inward, slowly, quietly, corrosively. And once fear becomes internal, it stops protecting the state. It starts hollowing it out. The decay did not come all at once. It came in narrow margins, in decisions that seemed small enough to survive. Sparta's leaders could see the strain, even if they refused to name it openly. Fewer citizens meant fewer soldiers. Fewer soldiers meant thinner margins in war. The old assumption that discipline alone could compensate for numbers was becoming harder to sustain. Battles were no longer decided by terror at first contact. Other Greek states had learned, adapted, imitated enough to remove the shock. This was the quiet danger Sparta faced. The world was changing, and fear was losing its novelty. Inside the city, this reality produced anxiety rather than innovation. The instinct was not to ask how Sparta might change, but how it might preserve itself without changing at all. Attempts at adaptation did occur, but they were narrow, cautious, and constrained by fear of precedent. Small adjustments to property rules, limited reconsideration of who might count as a citizen. Technical fixes meant to stabilize numbers without altering the system's core logic. None of it went far enough. Every proposed reform raised the same unspoken question. If the old rules were no longer sufficient, what did that say about the system itself? And if the system could be questioned here, where else might doubt spread? So reforms were shaped to fail. They were layered onto existing institutions instead of replacing them. They preserved hierarchy, they avoided empowerment, they offered relief without trust, and as a result, they satisfied no one. For those excluded from full status, the changes were cosmetic. For the ruling elite, they felt dangerous. For the system as a whole, they introduced uncertainty without flexibility, a worst-case combination. The human cost deepened. Young men trained harder for fewer rewards. Older men held authority longer, not because they were effective, but because replacing them risked instability. Families watched inheritance laws tighten, even as their economic base shrank. The pressure to conform intensified, not because conformity produced strength, but because deviation felt existentially threatening. Sparta had once used discipline to create unity. Now, discipline enforced anxiety. The psychological toll was subtle but profound. A society built on collective identity now produced isolation. Trust eroded. Men measured one another not by loyalty but by risk. Every interaction carried the possibility of exposure. Silence became safer than honesty. Fear no longer flowed only from the state. It moved laterally. This lateral fear was corrosive. It discouraged initiative. It punished competence if competence attracted attention. It rewarded invisibility. Over time, this hollowed out leadership. Decisions grew slower, responses more cautious. Opportunities passed unrecognized because recognizing them required admitting vulnerability. Still, the image held. Beyond Sparta's borders, the myth remained intact. Stories traveled faster than facts. Memories of past defeats lingered longer than evidence of present weakness. Rival states argued among themselves about whether Sparta was still dangerous, and disagreement alone was enough to preserve hesitation. Fear did not need to be accurate, it only needed to be plausible. This bought Sparta space. It also delayed reckoning, because delay hardened the problem. Every year the citizen body failed to recover, made recovery less likely. Every year repression intensified, made trust harder to rebuild. Every failed reform confirmed the belief that change was dangerous and futility preferable to risk. The system was now caught in a loop. Weakness produced fear of change. Fear of change produced stagnation. Stagnation deepened weakness. And yet, from within, this loop felt like survival. Spartan leaders told themselves they were holding the line, that endurance was victory, that the alternative, opening the system, loosening control, trusting, adaptability, was an invitation to collapse. They could not see that collapse was already underway, just slow enough to feel manageable. What they sensed instead was exposure, the creeping awareness that Sparta's power now depended more on memory than capacity, that if tested directly, the outcome was no longer certain, and uncertainty was intolerable. So the reforms stopped, the tightening resumed, the rituals continued, the punishments remained visible and severe. Fear was reaffirmed as policy, but fear, once reaffirmed too often, begins to look desperate. And somewhere beyond Sparta's borders, others were watching closely. The test did not come all at once. It came cautiously, as probes always do. Sparta's rivals had been watching for years, measuring delays, counting absences, noting how often Sparta threatened force and how rarely it now followed through. The legend was still intact, but legends invite verification when circumstances change. At first, the challenges were indirect, diplomatic slights, border disputes handled with more confidence than caution, alliances formed without Spartan approval. None of these acts declared hostility outright. They did something more dangerous. They implied doubt. For generations, doubt alone would have been unthinkable. The risk of provoking Sparta had been too great. Now, that risk felt negotiable. Inside Sparta, these developments triggered alarm rather than clarity. The leadership recognized the shift but misread its cause. They interpreted external boldness not as a response to Spartan weakness, but as a failure of intimidation. The answer, once, again, was escalation. Public severity increased. Displays of discipline became more theatrical. Sparta reminded the Greek world who it claimed to be, not through reform or reassurance, but through ritualized menace. The message was blunt: challenge us, and you will regret it. But this message landed differently than it once had. Other states no longer saw a limitless war machine. They saw a rigid one, predictable, slow to mobilize, dependent on reputation rather than momentum. And for the first time, some began to calculate that the cost of testing Sparta might be survivable. This was the midpoint of Sparta's decline, the moment when fear stopped being unquestioned and became conditional. Internally, this shift exposed fractures that could no longer be contained. The ruling elite argued, not about whether Sparta was under threat, but about how much force was still necessary to sustain obedience at home and deterrence abroad. Some favored restraint, preserve strength, avoid exposure. Others demanded action. Harshness had worked before. It could work again, if applied decisively enough. What united them was fear. Not fear of enemies, but fear of acknowledgement. To admit that Sparta might no longer dominate was to undermine everything the system rested on, so the more aggressive voices prevailed. Sparta responded to doubt with demonstrations meant to remind everyone, citizens included, what resistance cost. The internal security apparatus tightened further. Surveillance intensified. Punishments became faster, less deliberative. The state was no longer correcting behavior, it was reacting to anxiety. This reaction signaled weakness more clearly than any external defeat. Rivals noticed. They adjusted. Challenges became more pointed, more coordinated, still cautious, but no longer deferential. Sparta now faced a dilemma it had spent centuries avoiding, whether to confront multiple pressures at once or retreat strategically and preserve its core. Retreat was unthinkable. Retreat required flexibility. It required admitting limits. It required trust in negotiation rather than fear. Sparta had none of these tools left, so it chose confrontation, carefully framed to avoid full exposure, but aggressive enough to preserve the myth. This half-measure pleased no one. It failed to terrify rivals and exhausted internal reserves. The illusion cracked, not dramatically, not in a single battle or decree. It cracked in perception, in the realization spreading quietly across Greece that Sparta could be pushed, and that pushing did not always provoke catastrophe. Once that realization existed, it could not be contained. Inside the city, the cost was immediate. Resources stretched thinner. Decision-making slowed under the weight of indecision masked as tradition. Leaders hesitated, not because they lacked authority, but because authority without capacity is dangerous to exercise. Fear still governed, but it no longer commanded. Sparta had crossed an invisible threshold. Its reputation was no longer a shield, it was a liability. Every failure, every delay, every overreaction reinforced the sense that the system was straining to hold together. The world was changing its mind, and Sparta, locked inside the logic that had once made it powerful, could not change with it. Fear still worked. That was the problem. Even as rivals pushed closer, even as confidence eroded, no one moved against Sparta lightly. The memory of what Sparta had once been remained heavier than evidence of what it had become. Caution lingered, hesitation persisted, and as long as that hesitation existed, Sparta could convince itself that its methods were justified. The system interpreted restraint as validation. Inside the city, this belief deepened the damage. If fear still restrained enemies, then fear must be intensified internally to preserve the same effect. Repression became not just a tool, but a doctrine. Every sign of doubt was treated as a precursor to collapse. The result was corrosion. Institutions designed to produce cohesion now produced exhaustion. Offices rotated among a shrinking pool of men. Authority became concentrated, not by design, but by necessity. The same figures appeared again and again in positions of power, not because they were exceptional, but because there were so few alternatives left. This concentration bred resentment, and fear of that resentment bred further control. Ordinary Spartans felt the change acutely. Their lives had always been regulated, but regulation had once carried purpose. Now it felt defensive, reactive. Rules multiplied without explanation. Enforcement became harsher even as justification grew thinner. Discipline no longer promised strength, it promised survival, barely. The human cost was cumulative. Men aged into roles they were unprepared for, trained for a system that no longer functioned as promised. Young men sensed the contradiction early. They were told they were inheriting the greatest military tradition in Greece. They could see the empty places where that tradition had once stood. No one acknowledged this aloud. Families adapted in quiet ways. They delayed decisions. They minimized attention. They taught caution where courage had once been prized. In a society that claimed to despise fear, fear had become the organizing principle of daily life. The state noticed these shifts and misread them. Where it saw hesitation, it assumed disloyalty. Where it saw withdrawal, it suspected weakness. The response was uniform: more surveillance, more punishment, more reminders of consequence. This was fear feeding on itself. Beyond Sparta, observers began to understand the pattern. The city still projected menace, but it was a brittle menace, dependent on repetition. Every display needed to be louder than the last to achieve the same effect. That escalation carried risk. Each time Sparta acted harshly, it revealed how much it needed fear to function. Each time it threatened punishment, It confirmed that persuasion and adaptation were no longer available tools. Rival states adjusted their calculations accordingly. They did not rush to confront Sparta. They waited, they coordinated, they tested limits carefully, watching how Sparta responded. What they saw was not confidence, it was overreaction. Inside the ruling elite, unease grew sharper. They sensed that the system was consuming itself, but they could not imagine an alternative that did not invite immediate collapse. Fear had shaped their thinking for generations. To abandon it felt like stepping into darkness without armor. So they endured. Endurance became the virtue that replaced victory. Holding on replaced moving forward. The goal narrowed to preservation of form rather than function. Sparta still frightened others, but that fear now served a different purpose. It bought time, not dominance. Delay, not security. And delay came at a cost the city could no longer afford. Every year that passed without renewal increased dependence on the very mechanisms causing decay. Every act of repression weakened the social fabric it was meant to protect. Every silence widened the gap between myth and reality. Sparta had become a society defending an image of itself that no longer existed. Fear still restrained enemies, but it now poisoned the city from within, and poison, once circulated long enough, reaches the heart. By this point, Sparta's choices had narrowed to almost nothing. The leadership could feel it. The pressure was no longer abstract. It arrived as delays that could not be explained away, as mobilizations that took longer than they should, as allies who asked questions instead of waiting for instructions. The margin for error, once buffered by terror and reputation, had thinned to a line. And still, the instinct was not to open the system. It was to close it completely. Escalation became policy. Not escalation toward innovation, but toward control. The state doubled down on what it knew how to do. Enforce, restrict, intimidate. If fear was eroding, the answer was more fear. If authority was questioned, the response was to make questioning unthinkable. This was Sparta's final adaptation attempt, and it was not adaptation at all. Political life narrowed further. Decision-making concentrated in fewer hands, drawn from an ever-shrinking pool of men shaped by the same assumptions, the same training, the same fear of deviation. Debate did not disappear, but it became circular. Every proposal was filtered through the same constraint. Would this preserve control? If the answer was uncertain, the proposal died. This logic eliminated risk, but it also eliminated possibility. The ruling elite knew that the system was fragile. What they did not know was how fragile, and because they could not measure that fragility, they treated it as absolute. Any change might be the one that broke everything. Any concession might trigger a cascade they could not stop. So they chose rigidity. Externally, Sparta's posture hardened. Threats were issued more readily. Commitments were framed in absolutes. The city projected certainty even when it lacked capacity to follow through. This was dangerous, but backing down felt worse. Backing down meant exposure. Rivals sensed the pattern clearly now. Sparta spoke loudly because it could not afford to act often. It punished severely because it could not sustain prolonged pressure. Its responses were sharp, immediate, and unsustainable. This did not embolden everyone, but it emboldened enough. Inside Sparta, the human cost sharpened into something more severe than exhaustion: resignation. Men no longer believed the system would reward them. They believed it would merely endure them, as long as they caused no trouble. Ambition narrowed. Loyalty became procedural rather than emotional. Obedience remained, but it was hollow. The state mistook this for success. From above, quiet looks like order. From within, quiet feels like suffocation. Attempts at limited adaptation continued at the margins. Minor adjustments, technical fixes, gestures meant to signal responsiveness without altering fundamentals. But these attempts were swallowed by the broader atmosphere of fear. No reform could survive long enough to matter when trust no longer existed. Trust was the one resource Sparta could not replenish. It had been sacrificed, gradually, in exchange for control. And now, without trust, Even correct decisions carried suspicion. Even necessary changes felt dangerous. The system had trained its people to see flexibility as betrayal. This was the narrowing path. Every option now led through the same corridor. More repression, more reliance on reputation, more insistence that endurance itself was victory. The future was no longer something to be shaped. It was something to be held at bay. Sparta still frightened others, but that fear had become static. It no longer expanded influence. It merely delayed confrontation. And delay, under these conditions, was indistinguishable from decline. The city stood, rigid, disciplined, and increasingly alone. Its enemies were no longer rushing toward it. They were waiting. And Sparta, having closed every door but one, could only keep walking forward, into a future it no longer had the strength to control. The end did not arrive with a single blow. It arrived as confirmation. When confrontation finally came, open, unavoidable, stripped of diplomacy, it exposed what fear had been concealing for decades. Sparta still fought with discipline, still marched in order, still invoked its ancient identity. But the margins were gone. The depth was gone. The reserve strength that once absorbed losses no longer existed. What had once been a system built to endure pressure now buckled under it. Rivals did not need to annihilate Sparta. They only needed to prove that it could be resisted, that its threats were finite, that its punishments, however severe, were no longer decisive. Once this was demonstrated, even carefully, the psychological balance shifted irreversibly. Fear broke first. The immediate aftermath was not chaos. It was something quieter and more devastating. Allies recalculated. Subject populations tested limits. Challenges multiplied, not because Sparta was suddenly weak, but because it was no longer unquestionable. Inside the city, the realization spread slowly and painfully. Not everyone accepted it at once. Some blamed betrayal. Others blamed insufficient severity. A few understood the truth and said nothing, knowing that understanding offered no remedy. The institutions responded as they always had. They tightened. But now, tightening produced no compliance, no renewed awe, only exhaustion. The citizen body continued to shrink. Offices rotated among the same aging figures. Rituals repeated themselves in spaces that felt too large for the voices left to fill them. Sparta still existed, but it no longer dominated events. This was not collapse as catastrophe. It was collapse as irrelevance. The political consequences were profound. Without fear to enforce obedience, Sparta lacked the tools to govern beyond its borders. Without flexibility to rebuild internally, it lacked the capacity to recover. It had traded adaptability for control, and when control failed, nothing remained to replace it. What had once been a terrifying presence became a cautionary one. In the generations that followed, Sparta lingered. It did not disappear overnight. Its name still carried weight. Its history was still taught. Its reputation still echoed in the imagination of others. But the society that had created that reputation was gone. What remained was form without function, discipline without purpose, tradition without power. Fear outlived strength, but only as memory. And memory is not authority. The final irony of Sparta's decline is this: the very system designed to ensure survival prevented renewal. The terror that once secured obedience eventually consumed trust. The rigidity that once guaranteed stability ultimately guaranteed stagnation. Sparta did not fall because it abandoned fear. It fell because it could not abandon it. And so it endured, shrinking and hardening, until endurance itself became indistinguishable from extinction. The world moved on. Sparta remained, feared in stories, respected in hindsight, but no longer capable of shaping the future it had once dominated. That is how power dies when it mistakes control for strength.